A few days earlier, the usually quiet Brentwood neighborhood had been suddenly engulfed in a terrifying nightmare. Inside the house that held her childhood memories, Romy Reiner stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock as she watched her parents lie motionless before her. Their bodies were riddled with fatal stab wounds, the marks of a brutal attack that left no chance of survival. When Los Angeles police arrived and officially confirmed it was a homicide, Romy's strength seemed to drain from her body. She collapsed on the spot in a state of severe shock and was rushed to the hospital in a near-paralyzed state. In her panic, she could barely speak, only repeating a single word, a desperate reflex. "Catch Nick, don't let him escape." After learning that Nick had been captured, Romy gradually regained consciousness, but the pain and trauma weighed heavily on her mind. Under immense pressure from the media, Romy decided to speak out. What she revealed was not just the story of a family tragedy, but also a shocking truth. She, indirectly and unintentionally, contributed to the deaths of her parents. So what exactly did Romy Reiner do? An interview with CBS News will expose the dark secrets hidden behind the Reiner family, a family once considered perfect. On the afternoon of December 14th, as the last rays of winter sunlight streamed through the window, Romy was shocked to learn that her parents were not answering their phones. A feeling of unease immediately overwhelmed her. Without hesitation, she drove to their familiar home in Brentwood, a place filled with countless warm family memories. The moment she opened the door and stepped inside, the sight before her made Romy's heart stop. Her father lay motionless on the floor, his neck and chest clearly showing signs of violence. Blood soaked the wooden floor. In the nearby kitchen, her mother was also lifeless. Trembling, Romy cried out in panic, calling her parents' names, unable to believe what was happening. After only a few seconds, she realized this wasn't a mistake or a cruel joke. The horrific truth was right before her eyes. In a state of utter shock, Romy tried to compose herself and act. She immediately called 911, her voice trembling, but trying to remain calm. She pleaded for help, saying her parents were no longer breathing. The wait for the rescue team felt endless, each passing second deepening her pain. Only when the authorities arrived did Romy learn that her mother had also passed away in that once peaceful home. Not stopping at calling for emergency services, Romy continued to contact close family members, breaking the bad news and seeking support. In each call, her voice choked, but she still managed to tell the truth. Her parents were gone. Longtime family friends quickly arrived to be with her, sharing her unspeakable grief. When the police officially announced that Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner were dead and that it was a homicide, the atmosphere in the house froze. Romy stood motionless, her eyes wide, her heart pounding before her whole body went numb. The police's words echoed vaguely, unable to reach her mind. A cold, empty feeling spread through her, as if everything familiar had vanished in an instant. Finally, panic erupted. Romy collapsed to the floor, her hands covering her face, tears streaming down her face. Between sobs, she repeatedly called out Nick's name, a desperate cry for help, clinging to the faint hope that this tragedy could still be prevented. After leaving the scene, Romy was taken to the ambulance in a near-unconscious state. All the way to the hospital, she continuously whispered Nick's name, as if repeating it could cling to something that had completely shattered. Her voice grew weaker, each word disjointed, tears mingling with her ragged breaths as her body could no longer cope. Each breath was painful, reminding Romy that her parents were truly gone forever. Upon arriving at the hospital, doctors immediately intervened to stabilize Romy's condition. However, their greatest concern wasn't her physical state, but her mental state. Romy barely spoke, didn't answer questions, and simply wept silently with her head bowed. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of her parents lying motionless reappeared so vividly that she couldn't bear it. A doctor gently reassured her that she was safe, that everyone would take care of her, but Roma only nodded slightly, tears still silently streaming down her face. The next day, Romy was diagnosed with acute PTSD, a severe form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Even the slightest sound or a sudden flash of light in the hospital room was enough to startle her and make her cry. She was almost unable to speak, sitting silently with her head bowed, as if all words had vanished along with the belief that her parents were still alive. Relatives, friends, and medical staff had to be constantly by her side, holding her hand and whispering words of comfort to remind her she wasn't alone. But even that warm presence could only alleviate a very small part of the immense emptiness she was carrying. And if you've watched this far, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. If you feel sorry for Romy, please comment a year or one. We appreciate your empathy. In Romy's mind, memories of that day kept returning. Every detail in the house, every blood stain, every familiar object was imprinted with painful clarity. Most of the time, she rarely looked up at anyone. When she did, her eyes were empty, as if she were no longer fully aware of the world around her. The sound of footsteps, the distant ambulance siren, was enough to make her tremble, tears welling up again. There were no questions, no words, only prolonged silences of despair and loneliness. At times, Romy let out very soft moans, as if calling out her parents' names in vain. It wasn't until December 16th, nearly 2 days after being consumed by pain and tears, that Romy gradually regained some composure upon learning that her younger brother, Nick Reiner, had been arrested by the police. The initial extreme panic began to subside, giving way to a simmering anger rising from deep within. For the first time since the tragedy, Romy could think more clearly, realizing that this wasn't just her personal loss, but a real crime where responsibility and consequences were unavoidable. However, just as her spirits began to stabilize, another shock struck. Romy's phone suddenly rang. On the other end was Nick's trembling, choked voice calling from prison. He begged Romy for $4 million to get him released on bail. Those pleas only fueled her rage. Each word Nick spoke seemed to tear apart the pain and loss he had inflicted on his parents and on this very family. Unable to restrain herself any longer, Romy burst out in fury, resolutely refusing. She said that the money would never belong to Nick, that he had no right to use family assets to evade consequences. Every word was cold and harsh, completely severing the last shred of patience she had for her brother. In that call, Romy poured out all the resentment, disappointment, and feeling of betrayal she had suppressed for years, asserting that blood ties, property, and trust were not things to be exploited. Despite her public statement, Romy's anger remained unabated. Nick's demands for money continued to haunt her, a stark symbol of his callousness, further solidifying her resolve to remain clear-headed and protect what belonged to her family. Romy sat silently, her eyes fixed on her phone screen, the echoes of the previous call still reverberating in her mind. Nick's tearful pleas now only resonated with her as coldness and an unwavering determination to seek justice for her parents. Throughout that day, Romy was in constant contact with the family lawyer, David L. Cohen, and maintained close communication with the investigating authorities. She wanted to ensure that every step in the case was conducted transparently and in accordance with the law. Romy understood that maintaining this cooperation was not only essential for the legal process, but also the only way to protect the assets and legacy her parents had painstakingly built. Every call, every email was closely monitored by her, allowing no room for error. Romy realized that, besides the pain of loss, she now had to stand up and protect her family's interests. The approximately $200 million fortune was not simply money, but the culmination of the values, hard work, and love her parents had dedicated their lives to building. Silently, Romy told herself that she couldn't let Nick seize it all. Her voice trembled, but was firm, like a vow to the memory of her parents. Every time Nick Reiner's name was mentioned, Romy's anger flared up. She believed her brother didn't deserve anything belonging to the family, and protecting that fortune wasn't just a legal obligation, but also a way for her to confront the person who had caused the tragedy. In her conversations with lawyer Cohen, Romy provided a detailed list of accounts, properties, and investments, demanding that every procedure be subject to the strictest oversight. She repeatedly emphasized that Nick would never be allowed to touch her parents' assets. These assertions sounded like a decisive command, both a warning and a declaration that the power and responsibility now rested in her hands. Each legal step was carefully considered, from freezing accounts to establishing mechanisms for managing the estate, all aimed at ensuring that Nick could not exploit any loopholes. Romy closely followed every development from the investigative authorities, while ensuring that all documents related to the assets were legally signed and authenticated. Although her body still trembled from the terrible psychological aftershocks, Romy's inner strength had now become more resilient than ever. She understood that protecting her family's legacy was not only a legal responsibility, but also the only way to preserve and honor the memories and values her parents had dedicated their lives to building. In silence, Romy vowed to herself that she would not let anyone harm what her parents had created. While Romy was using all her remaining composure to handle the legal issues and protect her family's legacy, the world outside Brentwood seemed to slow down in grief. News of the deaths of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner spread rapidly, enveloping Hollywood in a somber atmosphere. Memorials flooded social media, from fans to close colleagues, all expressing shock and sorrow at their sudden passing. Romy quietly followed each shared message. Memories of classic films and personal stories about the influence her parents had on the artistic lives of many people constantly appeared on the screen. Each line choked her up. Her parents were not only the pillars of the family, but also spiritual symbols of a vast artistic community. This realization moved Romy deeply, yet left her with an indescribable emptiness, because all those tributes came with the unchangeable truth that they were no longer with her. Artists and longtime family friends continued to post heartfelt tributes. They mentioned Rob Reiner's talent, character, and kindness, qualities that left a profound mark on generations. These messages spread widely through the media, offering some comfort, while also deepening Romy's pain as she faced the scale of her family's loss. However, along with that wave of remembrance, media pressure also began to mount around Romy. Cameras, microphones, and lenses were constantly pointed at her. Phones rang incessantly with calls from major and minor news outlets. Reporters appeared outside her residence, waiting for a response, a statement, a moment they could capture, while Romy remained deeply immersed in the psychological shock she had not yet recovered from. Each time the phone rang, Romy's heart tightened. Interview requests poured in, all with the same demand: talk about her feelings, recount the tragedy that had just occurred. But Romy couldn't respond. To her, each question was like a knife, digging deeper into a wound that hadn't yet healed. She remained silent, her eyes red, tears silently falling as anger and despair intertwined within her. This onslaught didn't stem from the press's hostility, but from the harsh circumstances Romy was forced to face. Having just lost her parents, she had become the center of public attention. Day after day, the interview requests continued to pile up, bringing with them ever-increasing pressure. They wanted to hear her speak, to record her pain, while Romy felt trapped in a cramped space where pain and scrutiny relentlessly squeezed her every breath. By December 17th, 3 days after the tragedy, Romy had virtually no privacy left. She couldn't go outside, couldn't escape the watchful eyes of everyone around her. The ringing of the phone, the knocking on the door, the incessant clicking of cameras startled her, her heart pounding. The pressure from the media had reached its breaking point. Romy understood she couldn't continue to avoid it forever, even though deep down she just wanted to disappear from everyone's sight. And it was in this suffocating situation that Romy was forced to make a difficult decision, a decision that would lead her to a moment of public confrontation where a truth even more painful than her loss was about to be revealed. Finally, under the increasing pressure from the media, Romy agreed to sit down for an interview with CBS News. She understood perfectly well that once she appeared before the cameras, every word she spoke would spread across America, and even a small mistake could be exaggerated. When Romy entered the frame, she looked like someone who had just woken up from a long, unending nightmare. Her face was pale, her eyes red from lack of sleep and excessive crying, and her lips trembled slightly. Yet, in that weary gaze there was a glimmer of fragile determination. From the very first seconds, viewers could clearly sense the tension and exhaustion in Romy's every movement. She sat upright, her hands clasped tightly, as if trying to hold onto her last shred of composure. When she began to speak, her voice trembled, each word uttered slowly and heavily. Romy pleaded with the public to leave her family in peace, for they had already suffered so much pain and trauma in such a short time. She paused for a moment, wiped away her tears, then continued, in a voice that tried to be more steady. Romy said that no one could imagine the feeling of losing both parents in an instant. Her family needed time to breathe, to cry, and to try to keep living. She earnestly hoped everyone would respect their privacy, because what they were going through was beyond anyone's endurance. As Romy spoke, fear still shone in her eyes. Her hands were clasped tightly on her thighs, each breath a struggle to keep from collapsing in front of the camera. At times her lips trembled, a tear slowly rolled down her cheek, but Romy still tried to continue, as if determined to send a clear message that private pain is not something to be displayed for public curiosity. Then Romy began to recount the past 2 horrific days, from the moment she discovered her parents' bodies in their familiar home to witnessing her younger brother's arrest. When she mentioned the first time she saw her parents lying motionless, her voice choked up. She said everything happened so quickly that she didn't have time to understand what was happening. her heart shattered at that very moment. When the interviewer brought up that detail again, Romy couldn't hide her trembling. She confessed that she had never imagined witnessing such a horrific scene. Every word carried the fear and helplessness she had been suppressing for days. Romy's eyes gleamed with panic, tears welling up, allowing the viewer to fully feel the despair she had experienced. Romy continued to recount the moment she was forced to call the police. Though her voice still trembled, she said she had no other choice. Picking up the phone and saying those words was almost beyond her endurance. A mixture of tension, fear, and a vague feeling of guilt intertwined, causing Romy to pause for a few seconds to catch her breath before continuing. Tears silently streamed down her face as she tried to recount each detail as truthfully as possible. Each word Romy shared drew the listener deeper into her pain, revealing the terrible psychological burden a daughter must bear when forced to act in such desperate circumstances. And then, just when the story seemed to have reached its tragic depths, Romy unexpectedly revealed something even more horrifying than anything before. In the heavy atmosphere of the studio, with tears still streaming down her face, Romy bowed her head for a long time before continuing. The entire crew seemed to hold their breath. Then, with a deep breath, as if forcing herself to confront the truth, she said something that no one in the room expected. Romy admitted that she felt she also bore some responsibility for the tragedy that claimed her parents' lives. According to her, she was an indirect accomplice, even though she didn't intend to. Romy recounted that the night before everything happened, the whole family had attended a party. The atmosphere was so tense it was hard to hide. The simmering conflicts between her parents and Nick were evident, though no one spoke them aloud. After the party, when everyone returned home, the unease in the Reiner family didn't dissipate, but became even heavier. That night, Romy's parents called her, utterly terrified. Her mother's voice trembled as she said she was worried Nick might lose control. She begged Romy to stay with them that night, just to be safer. Her father stood beside her, his voice full of anxiety, hoping his daughter would come immediately. In that call, their fear wasn't hypothetical, but a very real, very close feeling. Romy choked back tears as she recounted that moment, which became the biggest trauma of her life. After a tiring day at work, she thought it was just another familiar argument. She said she refused, apologized to her parents for being too exhausted, and promised to visit the next morning. Before hanging up, she even told them to lock the door carefully. That was the last time Romy heard her mother's voice. At this point, Romy couldn't remain calm any longer. She burst into tears in front of the camera, her shoulders shaking. She said that if she had come that night, perhaps things would have been different. Perhaps she could have stopped Nick. Perhaps her parents were still alive. That guilt, according to Romy, has never left her since the tragedy, but has been gnawing away at her mind little by little. Romy continued to speak of her brother with a mixture of fear and helplessness. She described Nick as someone who could explode at any moment, someone whose rage she always worried would destroy everything. According to Romy, Nick had struggled with addiction for a long time, but his violence didn't just stem from drugs. Even when sober, Nick could change in seconds, from normal to so aggressive that everyone around him would avoid him. She recounted that about 3 months before the tragedy, Nick unexpectedly returned home after a long absence. When Nick walked in, her parents clasped hands, trying to remain calm, but their eyes filled with fear. Her father had told Nick they wanted to help, but asked him to promise not to harm anyone. Nick nodded, but his gaze sent a chill through the room. In Romy's memory, Nick's outbursts were vivid and haunting. Screams echoed throughout the house. Furniture was thrown around, shattering on the floor. Cups, bottles, and decorations were broken and scattered everywhere. Each time, people were forced to retreat or run outside to find safety. These scenes were not rare occurrences, but gradually became a constant state of affairs, enveloping the house in an unending tension. To Romy, Nick was not just an addict with unpredictable behavior. He was a potential danger, capable of exploding at any moment. Every time Nick appeared, the atmosphere in the house instantly became as tense as a tightrope. Even her loving and patient parents lived in constant fear, always bracing themselves for a sudden outburst of anger. Romy's eyes now revealed the accumulated trauma of many years. Seeing her younger brother as both family and a constant threat had left her with a deep, unnameable fear. When confronted with the truth that Nick was responsible for the tragedy, Romy couldn't hide her rage and despair. She admitted that despite the familial bond, her anger was undeniable, especially as she realized that guilt was also weighing heavily on her. At the end of the interview, Romy returned with a single message she wanted to send. Her voice was still trembling, but this time it carried a clearer determination. She reiterated her plea to the media and the public to leave her family in peace. According to Romy, what they had already gone through was more than enough for a lifetime, and what they needed now was not curiosity, but space to mourn and heal. Those words rang out like a boundary drawn after days of pent-up emotions. It was both the voice of a child who had lost both parents and a final attempt to protect the little privacy she had left. As Romy spoke, her emotions overflowed, impossible to conceal. Pain was evident on her face, but she still tried to keep her words from breaking in front of the camera. When the interview ended, Romy wiped away tears. Her eyes were swollen and red, her gaze weary, but no longer completely panicked as before. She understood that speaking those painful truths was only part of the journey ahead. Behind the camera, the responsibility of protecting her family, preserving her parents' legacy, and facing reality awaited her every day. Outside, media attention remained undiminished, but at that moment, Romy began to transform her pain into a silent strength, not through loud condemnation, but through unwavering determination and composure. She used her own voice to affirm that this loss was not a story to be exploited, but a genuine tragedy of a real family. In this tragedy, Romy was perhaps the most deeply wounded. She not only witnessed the deaths of her parents, but also had to confront the cruel truth about her younger brother, while simultaneously bearing immense pressure from public opinion and the media. These wounds are immeasurable and cannot be fully expressed in words. Looking back on everything that happened, many wonder how a person could endure such a terrible shock and still remain strong. How could she simultaneously be in pain and maintain her composure to protect her family and the values her parents left behind? In Romy, pain, regret, anger, and love intertwine, creating a heavy emotional burden, but also clearly portraying the image of a daughter trying to rise above an irreplaceable loss. Perhaps no one can truly understand Romy Reiner's pain, but her story is a reminder that family, memories, and love are the most precious things a person possesses, and when those values are threatened, people can find a strength they never knew they possessed. The interview ended in silence. There was no dramatic conclusion, only the lingering echoes of a tragedy that could not be closed, and the image of a young woman carrying both loss and responsibility, moving forward with her pain still intact.